You hear these stories about pilots, people who are just so grounded in the reality of flight.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they see something that just like completely throws their whole worldview out the window.
Right.
It makes you think about like, what are we really sharing our skies with? You know what I mean? Like this TWA pilot, Phil Schultz, back in '83 over Lake Michigan. He's flying along, and all of a sudden this massive object, like the size of a football stadium, just appears.
Oh.
It doesn't like grow from a point in the distance or anything. He says it was just suddenly there, like full size. I mean, imagine that.
Yeah.
And this thing, it moves with incredible speed, pulls a turn that was later estimated at something like 20 Gs, which is just mind-boggling.
20 Gs, that's insane.
Yeah, just vanishes.
Poof.
And radar.
Nothing.
That's wild.
It wasn't just a fleeting glimpse either. This was a sustained encounter that just totally flipped his understanding of what's possible. So, welcome to the Deep Dive, everybody, where today we're focusing on aviation safety and unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAP. Yeah, the Schultz experience, it's not unique, It really echoes a lot of other encounters that maybe haven't gotten as much attention. And that's partly why we're diving into this multi-subreddit AMA today. We've got some amazing insights from Leslie Kean, the investigative reporter, Dr. Richard Haines, who's a former NASA scientist and the founder of NARCAP, that's the National Aviation Reporting Center on Anomalous Phenomena. And we also have Ryan Graves, former Navy pilot, and he's currently the executive director of Americans for Safe Aerospace. So yeah, really a great group of perspectives here.
And for our listeners, we want to make sure we're presenting this in a way that's informative, but not overwhelming. So today we're really zeroing in on those key facts, the surprising details about the risks UAP potentially pose to aviation safety. And just as importantly, what's being done to understand and hopefully mitigate those risks.
Exactly. We're not going to get lost in speculation. We're sticking to the facts, the first-hand accounts, the credible sources.
So think about it. Aviation, such a highly regulated, procedure-driven world. And then you have these UAP encounters, completely unpredictable, largely unknown.
Right. It's almost like these two worlds are colliding.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll be looking at the history, the challenges pilots face when they see something, the push for transparency, safer skies. Basically, our mission here is to pull out the key insights for you from all these sources.
Makes sense.
So over the next little bit, we're diving into all sorts of things. Dr. Haines' early work with NARCAP, documenting these events when nobody else wanted to touch them. And then we'll talk about those recent drone and UAP incursions near military bases, which is, a whole other layer of concern. We'll look at that balance of keeping pilots informed but not freaking out the public, the stigma around reporting, all those efforts to get better reporting mechanisms in place.
All important stuff.
Absolutely. And then, Ryan's got some fascinating firsthand accounts from commercial pilots, really compelling cases. So we'll get into that, how the risks are assessed, why it's so hard to share information sometimes, and the need for pilots to actually get training on how to deal with these encounters.
Which is, pretty shocking when you think about it.
Totally. And then, just to round things out, we'll touch on some specific pieces of evidence, like the Costa Rica photograph, a really clear image. Why are pilot unions so silent on this? And then some of those documented cases of electromagnetic interference, which is pretty scary when you think about it. And, just the psychological impact of these encounters, people trying to signal these objects, and then the implications for the future of aviation safety. It's a lot, but it's all connected.
Well, let's start with Dr. Haines and NARCAP. Back in the day, even just a couple of decades ago, pilots saw something strange. It was basically career suicide to talk about it.
Seriously. Like people thought they were crazy or something.
Pretty much. It was just dismissed, ridiculed.
So Dr. Haines founding NARCAP in 2000, that was huge. Like pilots reporting UAPs, they risked everything. It took guts.
Oh, absolutely. And then, you have Leslie Kean's article in the Providence Journal back in 2001. That was really key in bringing NARCAP's work to light.
Right. That story about their study of 100 cases, those weren't just like, blurry lights in the distance. Those were incidents where UAP seemed to directly impact flight safety, the well-being of the pilots, like serious stuff that nobody else is talking about.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, why was there so much resistance to even acknowledging these reports? I guess maybe fear of the unknown, maybe they thought it would cause panic, but I think a big part of it was just that there was no framework for understanding it, like pilots are trained to follow procedures and UAPs just don't fit into that neat little box.
So true. Which brings us to the experiences of the pilots themselves, the impact on safety. Like Ryan Graves talked about this. Imagine you're flying, right? You're focused, and then boom, something completely unexpected shows up. You're going to react, maybe make a sudden maneuver, could even get target fixated. Like, you're so focused on this thing, you forget about everything else.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and those reactions, they might be trying to avoid a threat, but they can actually create a whole new danger, especially in crowded airspace or during takeoff or landing.
Sure, like those are the times when precision is absolutely essential.
Absolutely. But then Ryan also talked about the psychological impact. Imagine seeing something that just defies physics, and you're responsible for hundreds of people's lives.
That's got to be heavy.
He talked about this thing called ontological shock.
Yeah.
It's basically like your whole understanding of reality gets shaken to the core. There were pilots who literally drug tested themselves, trying to find some kind of rational explanation.
Wow, really?
And then you've got pilots who've kept these stories to themselves for years, afraid of being ridiculed, hurting their careers. We even heard about cases like Jake Barbara, who reported feeling this deep emotional connection during his encounter. Like, it's not just a visual thing for some people.
That's fascinating. So, what's the impact of that psychological burden long term? Could it affect their performance, their mental health? I mean, it's no wonder people don't report if they think they're going to be ostracized.
And that's where Dr. Haines' idea of pilot support groups comes in. Imagine a space where pilots can connect with others who've had similar experiences, share their stories, and realize they're not alone. Ryan mentioned that Americans for Safe Aerospace is planning this aviation safety summit. That could be a big step in that direction.
A safe space, right? To talk about this without fear of judgment, that's so important.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about those drone and UAP incursions near military bases. It's like starting around 2021, 2022, we see this uptick in reports. Langley Air Force Base, places in New Jersey. It feels different from those historical UAP reports, you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. We're talking about sensitive military installations. So now it's not just aviation safety, it's national security, the integrity of our airspace. Like Langley, that's a key part of defending DC.
Yeah.
So anything unauthorized there, that's a major concern.
And what's really unsettling is these aren't just like, your average drones. These objects are doing things that drones just can't do. And Ryan talked about this lack of clear protocols, no real response mechanisms. It makes you wonder, how do we protect our critical infrastructure when we don't even know what we're dealing with?
And Dr. Haines made this interesting point. He suggested that maybe the public is actually more ready to accept the reality of UAPs than, aviation officials think.
What do you mean?
Well, he's saying that all those movies, TV shows, all those years of UAPs in popular culture, maybe it's actually normalized the concept for people. Like, imagine a pilot comes on the intercom and says, hey, we're seeing something unusual out there. Maybe passengers would be more curious than panicked.
Interesting. But then he contrasted that with the anxiety within aviation management, the fear of disruption, liability concerns. It's like two totally different mindsets.
Yeah, it's a tough balance, right? Informing pilots without causing widespread panic. I kind of like Dr. Haines' take, though. Maybe the public is more prepared for this conversation than you think.
And then there's the stigma around reporting, which is a huge problem. Like, for years, the FAA just didn't want to deal with this stuff. Remember, as recently as 2010, their guidance was basically, tell civilian groups, not us. What does that tell you?
It says they weren't taking it seriously at all.
Exactly. And pilots, they were afraid to report. They didn't want to be grounded, ridiculed. It's no wonder there's so much underreporting. Ryan said that while things are slowly changing, many pilots still don't know how to report, or they face pushback from their bosses.
Right.
He really stressed the importance of using those official aviation safety channels, or reporting directly through safeaerospace.org.
Yeah, that makes sense. But then there's this feeling that even when you do report, it just goes into a black hole.
Totally. Point if nothing happens.
Here.
But there have been efforts to improve things, Dr. Haines worked with the ASRS, the Aviation Safety Reporting System run by NASA.
Okay, yeah.
And Ryan's been working with the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. They've been trying to give the ASRS recommendations on how to handle these reports better. There was even an interagency working group for a while, but it kind of stalled out.
Yeah, that's too bad. So it sounds like there are people who are trying, but it's slow going.
For sure. But there's some hope on the horizon. Ryan told us about this legislation introduced by Congressman Garcia and Congressman Gothman. This bill, it would actually require the FAA to keep all that UAP data. They'd have to modify the ASRS to handle these reports specifically. They'd have to educate pilots and, get this, provide whistleblower protection.
Whistleblower protection, that's huge. I mean, that could really change things, Finally, some accountability, some protection for people who come forward.
Now, Ryan shared some firsthand accounts that really blew my mind. Like this one pilot flying at 737, 15,000 feet, right? And this massive black triangle appears, bigger than his plane.
No way.
It gets within 500 feet of him, glowing blue and purple lights, and it's not showing up on radar at all. The pilot was so freaked out, he went and got drug tested afterward.
That's intense.
And then other pilots reporting near misses with these black triangles, disc-shaped objects. It makes you wonder how many of these encounters are happening that we never even hear about.
Yeah, it's probably just the tip of the iceberg. Dr. Haines, he estimated that reporting rates are super low, like way lower than for other aviation incidents. So yeah, there's a lot we're not seeing.
Okay, so risk assessment. What are the actual dangers here? It seems like the biggest risk isn't actually a collision, but the pilot's reaction.
That's what Ryan and Dr. Haines both said.
Right, like we were talking about that sudden maneuver, the confusion, especially during a critical phase of flight. Dr. Haines also mentioned those cases where pilots try to communicate with the objects, flashing lights, changing course, and that can be dangerous too. It takes your focus away from what you should be doing.
Right, it's a distraction.
And then there's the electromagnetic interference. NARCAP's data showed that something like 20% of cases involve some kind of EMI, which is a little scary.
Yeah, that's unsettling. So your instruments go haywire, what do you do?
And it's interesting. Dr. Haines said most UAP sightings used to happen at cruising altitude. But now, with all the new technology in cockpits, pilots are more visually aware during those lower altitude phases, like takeoff and landing. So maybe we're seeing more sightings during those critical moments.
Oh, that's not good. More sightings when there's less margin for error.
Okay, so let's talk about national security. It's a big question, right? How do you keep pilots safe, inform them about UAPs, but also protect classified stuff?
Right, tricky balance.
Ryan said that it's not the public's responsibility to protect classified programs, it's the government's. He said, look, we have technology like radar stealth. We can prevent commercial pilots from seeing things if we want to.
So the capability is there. The question is, are they using it?
Yeah, exactly. Which brings us to pilot training. If these encounters are happening, pilots need to know what to do. Ryan's been working with pilot unions, aviation organizations, trying to get UAP information into the training manuals. He said it's got to be part of the curriculum, right alongside things like how to handle space debris or bird strikes.
Right, it should be standard.
Dr. Haines made this analogy to wind shear training, which only became mandatory after a bunch of accidents. Sadly, he said that maybe we need a similar wake-up call with UAPs, a serious incident, before they take it seriously enough to make training mandatory.
I hope it doesn't come to that.
Me too. But it highlights the need to be proactive. Okay, let's talk about the Costa Rica photograph. This thing's amazing. 1971 government mapping plane, 10,000 feet over Lago de Cote, and they capture this crystal clear image of a disc.
A disc, like a classic flying saucer.
Yeah, clear as day. Dr. Haines and Jacques Vallée analyzed it. They estimated it was over 100 feet in diameter, metallic surface, based on how it reflected sunlight. And here's the crazy part, it only appeared in one frame of a series of photos taken every 20 seconds. So it just popped in and out of existence, basically.
Wow.
And the photo, it's not blurry, which means it was stationary when the picture was taken. Dr. Haines even suggested that maybe it was super thin, maybe even partially underwater, because there's no wake or disturbance in the water. It implies that it had very little mass, which is just bizarre.
It's like defying gravity or something.
Now, why are pilot unions so silent on all this? They're all about safety, but they haven't really taken a public stance on UAPs. It's strange.
It is kind of odd. Dr. Haines suggested that maybe they're worried about legal liability, Like if they acknowledge the issue, maybe they open themselves up to lawsuits or something.
That could be part of it. But Ryan had a slightly different take. He said, a lot of the push within these organizations comes from individual pilots. He also suggested that while unions could provide a safe reporting channel, they might be hesitant to do that without clear guidance or regulations.
Right, they don't want to overstep or take on too much risk.
Exactly. So it's a complex situation for them. Okay, so Dr. Haines also talked about these documented cases of electromagnetic interference. The one that really stuck with me was this DC-10 incident over New York. So the pilots are flying, and suddenly the autopilot disengages, the plane banks hard to the left, and all three compasses are giving totally different readings. And at the same time, they see this bright white object right outside the left wing.
Oh, that's creepy.
They disconnect the autopilot, take manual control, and the object just zooms away and disappears. What's interesting is, the way the DC-10's compass system is set up, the sensors are on the wingtips, directly connected to the cockpit displays. So if there was some kind of external magnetic field, it could totally explain those messed up readings.
Makes sense. And the pilot checked with Boston Center. No other traffic around, so it wasn't another plane or anything.
Ryan mentioned a similar case too, a sphere passing under a plane, causing the autopilot to shut off. And then there's that famous Iran incident in '76. Multiple planes had system failures near this huge object, plus they saw smaller objects shooting around. So the evidence suggests that UAP can definitely mess with our technology.
It's like another layer of risk we don't fully understand.
Right. Okay, so Dr. Haines also talked about the psychological and physiological effects on the people who have these encounters. It's like a whole process they go through.
Right, it's not just, oh, I saw something weird, moving on.
He said it starts with that initial shock, the adrenaline. Then curiosity kicks in, they try to make sense of what they're seeing, and then because it often challenges their whole belief system, they have to find ways to cope with that. And afterward, many of them start to question everything, big existential questions.
It's like a whole identity crisis on top of everything else.
Totally. That pilot who regretted not trying to communicate with the object, it shows that even in these crazy situations, we still have this basic human need to connect, to understand.
That's so human, right? Even when faced with something completely alien.
And that brings us to C5, human-initiated contact. Dr. Haines was initially skeptical, but then he found over 200 cases worldwide of people signaling UAPs, often with lights, and getting responses back. Like flashing a pattern and getting the same pattern back.
Whoa, are you serious? That's not random. That's communication.
And these reports come from all over the world, different time periods. It's a pattern. Dr. Haines even categorized the human responses, like some people were aggressive, shooting at the objects, throwing things. But others were more peaceful, just trying to signal. It's kind of a reflection of humanity itself,
Yeah, like how would we react to something totally unknown? Some with fear, some with curiosity.
And Ryan's seen these UAPs maneuvering intelligently around aircraft, so there's definitely some awareness there. Dr. Haines talked about all the potential ways they might communicate electromagnetic signals, maybe even things we don't understand yet, like psychic stuff, or even spiritual communication. It's mind-blowing.
It's like we're barely scratching the surface of understanding this.
And how do we even signal our intent? Are we coming in peace? Ryan said we don't even know what kind of receivers they have. Our radar signals, they might just interpret those as pings or interrogations.
Right, it's like trying to talk to someone who speaks a totally different language.
There are no protocols for this stuff. Ryan even wondered if there are classified programs working on communication strategies, which wouldn't surprise me.
It makes sense. Okay, so can we talk about that Japan Airlines Flight 1628 incident in '86? That one's a classic.
Oh yeah, Captain Kenju Torochi. He's flying over Alaska, sees this formation of lights. At first he thinks they're afterburners, but then they start moving in ways that are just impossible. And then this huge object appears, like aircraft carrier size, and it starts pacing his 747.
Wow, that must have been terrifying.
And get this, another 747 crew saw it too, and so did an FAA radar technician. The second pilot flashed his landing lights at the object, and it just took off at an incredible speed.
Wow, so multiple witnesses, and the poor captain, he got grounded for reporting it.
Yeah, it's a classic example of what pilots have had to deal with. Dr. Haines, he included all the documentation for that case in his archives at Rice University. It's that significant.
Good. It's important to preserve those stories.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about radar for a second. Back in the day, radar was a lot more raw. It took a human operator to interpret the data. So they'd see these weird blips alongside things like birds and weather. But as the software got better, it started filtering all that out. So maybe we're actually missing things now that we used to see.
Right. And Dr. Haines said something really interesting. He said that sometimes radar contact with these objects would just cut off instantly, not fade out gradually. Like, it implies they can change how they reflect radar waves somehow. We don't have technology that can do that.
That's wild. So we need to address the stigma, right? That's a big part of what Ryan's trying to do with Americans for Safe Aerospace. He wants to make it okay for pilots to talk about this stuff, to report without fear.
It's like we need a culture shift, right? From ridicule to curiosity.
Exactly. Dr. Haines talked about how at NASA, he had colleagues who were open-minded, they were willing to have these conversations, and he actually encouraged people to start local discussion groups, just to get people talking about it, to break down those barriers.
I love that. Open dialogue, treating it as a legitimate topic of scientific inquiry. That's how we move forward.
And Leslie Kean was actually pretty optimistic. She said we've come a long way since the early 2000s in terms of reducing the stigma. She thinks the government's attention in recent years has helped a lot.
That's good to hear. So, final question. What happens if we just keep ignoring this? Like, what are the long-term implications for aviation safety?
Dr. Haines is worried that we're going to have a serious accident, either because of pilot error or some kind of interaction with a UAP. Especially with all the new autonomous vehicles coming online, airspace is going to get even more complex.
Right, more unknowns, more potential for things to go wrong.
Brian agreed. He said, we're operating in an environment with these huge unknowns, and that's dangerous. We need to take this seriously now before something really bad happens.
So what are the key takeaways here? We've got pilot encounters, real, credible accounts. We've got this huge problem with reporting, the stigma, the lack of clear procedures. We've got people working hard to change things, legislation, training initiatives. And then we've got this fundamental question of, what does this all mean? What are these things? What do they want? How do we interact with them?
Exactly. And that's what I want our listeners to think about. We presented the evidence, the risks. So what needs to change? How do we approach this responsibly, not just in aviation, but in our understanding of the world? It's a big question, but it's one we need to start asking.
Keep learning, keep questioning. Check out the work of Dr. Haines, Ryan Graves, NARCAP, Americans for Safe Aerospace, Dr. Haines archives at Rice University. There's so much information out there. Stay curious.
Thank you all for joining us on the deep dive. And remember, stay curious, keep exploring. We'll be back soon with another deep dive.
See you then.
Bye, everybody.